If you pay attention to conservative websites, in very short order you will run across the idea of the shepherd. The theory runs like this: there are sheep, there are wolves, and there are shepherds. And the job of the shepherds is to protect the sheep from the wolves. It sounds like a Warner Brothers cartoon, the big sheepdog who punches in at 9 and punches out at 5. When I hear this argument, what I always hear is the underlying pecuniary and emotional rent seeking. So the way the article really runs is the argument really runs is the shepherd says, if you give me a significant portion of your income, which I intend to take by force, so we're only going to call it giving. If I take a significant portion of your income, and if you kiss my ass in public all the time, when push comes to shove, maybe I'll save you. Maybe I'll save you. There are all kinds of ridiculously bad ideas in there, but the worst idea of all is the idea of delegating self-defense. I've talked about this. I talked about this a week or two ago, 3 weeks ago maybe. Self-defense cannot be delegated. It is not the same thing to say that self-defense cannot be delegated in the same way that digestion cannot be delegated or mentation cannot be delegated. No one can think for you, no one can eat for you, but it is in fact possible to hire a third party to at least partially protect your life and property. Partially. And there are two problems with partially. Number one, the third party cannot be perfectly efficient at his job. No one is perfectly efficient at his job. And the second and much more serious defect is that when it comes time to defend lives, your defender will defend his own life first, which is completely appropriate. There's no reason that he shouldn't. No matter how much you pay him, there's no reason that he shouldn't. And the Secret Service agents who claim that they would jump in front of a bullet to save the president, we've seen that happen. With Ronald Reagan it happened. The name for these gentlemen is not shepherds, but schmoos. It is completely inappropriate to save a unrelated, a distant third party's life instead of your own. It makes perfect sense in that circumstance to jump in front of a bullet to save your wife or to save your child. But an uninvolved third party, you really kind of have to have a real tight bead on your hierarchy of values and decide what's most important to you in that circumstance. And if you choose badly, you will be dead forever. But the shepherd argument, I'll steal your stuff and maybe if you kiss my ass, maybe I'll save you. We have a name for that around here. There's more to it, and we'll get to that part of it too, but we call it the Batman fallacy. Assuming it's true, it's the Batman fallacy. And when I decide to do something that is avenging a wrong not done to me, for instance, Kathleen is wise and correct to say to me, that's the Batman fallacy. It's absolutely true. And what the entire content of the argument of the Batman fallacy is Batman is insane. The reason that Batman is insane, the actual comic character Batman, the reason that Batman is insane is that he puts everyone's interests ahead of his own. His life consists of putting everyone's interests ahead of his own. This is actually, in light of the fun I've been having with Ayn Rand and the Ayn Rand Institute lately, the Superman-Batman superhero style of comic book character is actually a response to Nietzsche, much the same way that the Fountainhead is a response to Nietzsche. Superman and Batman are a response to Nietzsche. So Nietzsche posits an Ubermensch, a Superman who is maximally talented, maximally intelligent, and minimally compassionate, who uses his talents to his own advantage, often at the expense of other people, or perhaps intentionally or systematically at the expense of other people. And Superman comics, the progenitor of the superhero phenomenon, takes someone like that, maximally talented, maximally intelligent, only maximally compassionate, who uses his talents to enslave himself to everyone other than himself, who sacrifices his interests ahead of any other interests. His interests are first to be sacrificed, last to be served, in fact, never to be served. But the insanity part of it is insisting or actually instantiating an inverted values hierarchy, putting strangers ahead of kin, putting other people ahead of yourself, dying so that someone you don't know, don't care about, and who may in fact be a greater peril to life than any other, including you, and you're dying in that behalf. This is completely absurd. This is disproportionate. This is anti-reality in the sense that your job is to preserve your own life and to preserve the lives of the people that you love. And if you fail in that, even as you are engaged in a phony act of virtue intended to elicit the approval of gawking strangers whom you also do not know, no matter what excuse you have for betraying your own interest, betraying your own interest is anegoistic, is self-destructive, is evil, is morally wrong. To betray your own interests in behalf of a stranger's is morally wrong. But the essence of the Batman fallacy is the belief or the affected belief in the fundamental justice of the shepherd, that when the shepherd engages in berserk violence, that's not crime, that's justice. When the shepherd kills innocents in pursuit of the bad guy that he never catches, that's not crime, that's justice. This is absurd, this is insane, and this is what's wrong with every argument, anarchist or minarchist or statist, obviously. Every argument you will hear about politics is wrong because all of them presume, number one, that there is such a thing as a shepherd, and number two, that the shepherd's actions are moral or are morally justifiable. And the first proposition is true only because a certain kind of incandescent neediness requires that public approbation, that public approval of the shepherd status. That's the only reason that the shepherds exist, in order to get their asses kissed. And they can't live without it. They're addicted to having their asses kissed. It's really pathetic. And the second argument is the second failure of that argument is the Batman fallacy itself, that Batman is insane, that if the shepherd actually does follow through, he is undoubtedly a greater threat to the peace than the miscreant that he's allegedly seeking vengeance upon. So Ayn Rand says we can't have private police forces. Rothbard says we're going to have private police forces, except they're going to be exactly like the current police force. The only difference will be that they won't claim a coercive monopoly on insane berserker Batman violence. They'll do their insane berserker Batman violence as freelancers, allegedly on the free market, and allegedly to be supported by sane, normal, rational people. In other words, Rothbard's premise, David Friedman's premise, the Block's premise, all of the arguments for so-called anarcho-capitalism insist that you, ordinary, decent, middle-class, law-abiding citizen, you, Joe Normal in the suburbs, cannot wait for the day when some agent of some private police force comes barging through your door, ransacks your home, steals your stuff, your computers, your files, your televisions, and then submits you to a cavity search and locks you in a cage. These things are all a part of the private police force paradigm as described by the so-called anarcho-capitalists. And I promise you that no sane person would ever volunteer for that sort of treatment. That if we are talking about a voluntarist society, a society in which all transactions are mutually agreeable, that everyone agrees to what's going to happen next, and any transactions which are not mutually agreeable are crimes, then we are not talking about any sort of police forces, whatever. Not anything that we describe as policing behavior, search, arrest, cavity search, captivity. None of these things could happen in an actual anarchy because no one would volunteer to be treated that way. No one would volunteer to be treated that way. So to insist that everyone in this civilization is a volunteer to it, everyone is a volunteer to everything that is proposed to happen systemically, and yet what you propose to happen systemically is exactly the sort of things that no one would ever volunteer for. So this is the Church of Splendor, And I frequently announce that the Church of Splendor is atheist, egoist, anarchist, and yet I almost never talk about anarchism. Well, today is the exception. Today we are talking about anarchism because I want to introduce an anarchy game that I invented earlier this week. The name of the game is Batman's Bounty, Batman's Bluff, Batman's Bet. I don't know what the name of it is. I don't like the names I've come up with so far. So after you watch this video, if you can come up with a better name, shoot it to me and I'll take it under advisement. But let's call it Batman's Bluff. That's what I've been calling it all week. It's a peacemakers game. It's a game that is devised to take situations that could result in violence and actively seeking to disincentivize the will to violence, disincentivize conflict that will result in bloodshed or the loss of life. So if there are no organized police forces in the Rothbardian sense, I mean, there can be security guards and there can be all kinds of passive security systems and locks and things like that. But your primary agent of self-defense in my kind of anarchy is going to be you, because self-defense cannot be delegated, and even if it could, it is unreliable. That when your presumably putatively reliable delegated self-defense fails, you will still be left with self-defense of your own life, the defense of your own life, the reflexive defense of your own life and property and loved ones, or they will not be defended. And the essence of my way of thinking about everything is to strip away the illusion, because that's the way things are right now. There is no difference between the situation I'm describing and the situation that obtains right now, that you have putatively effective delegated self-defense in the form of the state. You may also have putatively effective third-party free market delegated self-defense in the form of security guards or security systems or whatever. But nevertheless, when all of those systems fail, it will be down to you, your rifle, your shotgun, your handgun, your knife, and all the river rock you can pick up from your front yard landscaping. That will be your self-defense, and everything else will have failed. And if you fail in your self-defense, then it will have failed entirely and utterly. You will be gone from our midst. That situation obtains right now. There is no difference between the way you live right now and what I call anarchy, except the structure of illusions that you have built in your mind to convince you that you don't live in exactly that kind of anarchy right now, when in fact you do. The real difference is that if you live in my kind of anarchy, you know that your self-defense is your responsibility, your ultimate responsibility. And in our current situation, you pretend that your delegation not only protects your life completely, when of course it doesn't, but that you, in your turn, are incapable or incompetent or not allowed to defend your life. That's the difference, is that illusion in your mind. But let's suppose that there's some sort of conflict in my style of anarchy. There's some sort of conflict that somebody thinks somebody ought to do something. Somebody ought to do something about that. What we say now is there ought to be a goddamn law. Somebody ought to do something about that. So a friend of mine talked to me a while ago about a neighbor in his little suburban neighborhood who was exceptionally bad at landscaping, at lawn care. He had weeds growing in his yard, and it was making the neighborhood look bad. And this particular guy is house proud and really does a good job with his house, with his landscaping, with his yard, and didn't like the fact that his neighbor was pulling the neighborhood down. And this is a source of conflict that comes up every day. This is very common. Obviously, it's happening now, so it doesn't have anything particularly to do with anarchy. It's just it's the anarchy of real life is what it is. And he was working out how to deal with it, and he was really exercised, really upset, and considered responding aggressively, going over and saying, "Hey, come on, guy, can't you do a better job? Let's get this cleaned up." You know, that sort of aggressive neighbor behavior. But he had been listening to me talk about affectionate displays and decided to try it my way, and went across the street and just started schmoozing with the guy, making small talk, and saying, you know, I had a problem just like that, and here's what I did about it, you know, talking about the weeds. If you want, I can show you how I did it. I mean, volunteer to help. The guy's quickened a relationship. I don't know that they're friends now. I really don't know. I don't know what's happened since then, so it could be they've shot each other by now. But it was the beginning of an affectionate relationship. It was the beginning of affectionate persuasion, much more likely to be long-term successful, even if you bitch your neighbor into cutting down the weeds. 3 weeks from now, they'll be back again. Whereas if you work toward quickening a friendship and use that friendship as a way of sharing your values with your neighbor, then you could have achieved a long-term systemic solution to the problem, and maybe solutions to many more problems than you even know about at the time that you're going to deal with the weeds. But that's a pretty trivial problem. So imagine something much more serious. The neighborhood is infested with a serial tire slasher or something. I don't care what it is. That when you hear people talk about alleged bad people, they're always exaggerating. So I have no way of knowing. I have almost no experience with actual bad people in my life. I don't believe in crime because I don't see any of it. If you want to see crime, you have to go where it prospers. And if you're like me, white, middle class, suburban, relatively prosperous, I never see anything like that. I live in the most peaceful city in the United States, and also the most well-armed, and not coincidentally. But we've got a neighbor that we know about who is engaged in acts of vandalism or violence or whatever. He tortures his dog. And probably a better example anyway. This is one where Kathleen would decide to be Batman. My wife would decide to be Batman if someone were torturing a dog. So we have a neighbor who's torturing a dog, and we know he's torturing the dog because we hear the dog every day being tortured. We hear the dog yelping and howling. And somebody says, we got to do something. Somebody got to do something. We got to do something about that. Some hothead decides that it's his fucking business. I will tell you that I don't think it's my business at all. I don't care for the behavior. I think it's morally atrocious. But as with abortion, also morally atrocious, any response I might make is worse, in my opinion, is a greater threat to the peace than the crime I'm allegedly avenging, and therefore I would do nothing about this. I would do nothing about it. It's his property. It's his business. He's an asshole. I will not do business with him. I will not engage with him socially in any way at all, because that's the purpose of social distance, is to cut people off when they're not your social equals. They are your political equals, but they're not your social equals necessarily. And to treat people as your social equals when they are openly, actively evil is to fertilize evil. I don't do it. But I wouldn't do anything else. And if we have some hothead in the neighborhood who insists, we got to do something, God damn it, we got to do something, and maybe some of the other neighbors agree because they don't like hearing the dog yelping, they don't like hearing their kids yelping, hearing the dog yelping, they don't like having their kids know that this kind of stuff is possible, and they really don't want to have their children seeing conduct like this go on unanswered. There can be a lot of reasons why people might want to intervene. I named my reasons that I would not want to intervene, but I don't tell people what they should do. I offer abstract, general moral admonitions, but I don't tell anybody what to do unless they're in my way. And then I get my way. I don't really care. But suppose a hothead convinces a significant number of neighbors that they got to go over there and do something about it. We got to put a stop to this. This is a recipe for violence. This is exactly the kind of recipe for violence that people refer to in order to buttress their arguments for a monopoly state. Oh, goddamn, it's random vengeance, it's mob violence, I forget the name of it, it's a witch hunt, there are all kinds of different names for this. Vigilante justice. We have all kinds of dirty words for this, for describing normal everyday events, things that happen all the time, and we give them dirty word names so we can rationalize doing viciously unjust things like putting the cyst of a 40%, 50% behemoth on the back of every taxpayer in order to avoid random tire slashings and dog torturings. This is disproportionate also, isn't it? But in any case, the hothead insists that we got to do something about this, and some of his neighbors agree, and so they're going to form their own little ad hoc posse that's going to go over and confront this neighbor and get him to stop torturing his dog. This is a recipe for violence. This is just asking for violence. And the person who is most likely to cause that violence is the hothead who insists that we have to do something. The so-called shepherd is the greatest threat to the peace in your neighborhood because he thinks his violence is morally justified. Crime is not justified. Dog torturing is not justified. Tire slashing is not justified. Growing too many weeds in your yard is not justified. But taking your fucking neighbor and shooting him in the head, oh, that's completely morally justified because I'm a shepherd. Kiss my ass. This is disgusting. This is revolting. And this is what is wrong with virtually every argument about political philosophy, is that super moral shepherd, that Ubermensch, is presumed in every one of these discussions. There is always the presumption that there will be somebody who will be putatively licensed to commit vicious, violent, atrocious, bloody, murderous crimes in the name of moral righteousness and political justice. Rah, rah, rah. Let's play some songs. The shepherd is a criminal because Batman is insane. And so how can we have this little posse that's going to go over and deal with the dog torturer and minimize the opportunities for outrageous criminal violence? And my answer is the game that I invented this week, Batman's Bluff. In fact, it's a variation on the topic that I took up 4 or 5 weeks ago, where I suggested disarming all federal agents, that no employee of the federal government can go armed on the job. If they require violent intervention, if they require armed intervention, they need to appeal to local authorities for those men at arms. And if the local authorities are not willing to put their lives on the line, then there will be no violent intervention. I think this makes perfect sense. And in the same respect, in our little posse, every one of these men is going to be armed, because everyone is armed in my postulated anarchy. Everyone goes around armed all the time, and I suggest being armed like Lazarus Long. A main firearm, a backup firearm, 1 or 2 really good knives, and serious hand-to-hand combat training if you think you need it. But definitely one sidearm. Everybody would be presumed to be carrying at least one sidearm, and therefore there would be no street crime. 0 street crime. None. No muggings, no carjackings, no bank robberies, no jewelry store smash and grabs. None of that would happen because everyone is armed, and every criminal would be either instantly dead or a former criminal. It would take 3 or 4 years for this shakeout to occur, and there would be a lot of violence in that time, and the headlines would be unending about the violence. But at the end of 3 or 4 years, the civilization will have shaken out, and there will not be any more criminals. There won't be any more actual criminals in the sense that one stranger tries to despoil another. This will not happen, certainly not at the street crime level. It may continue to happen at the bankster level, because that's something that can't be directly cured with firearms. But at the street crime level, these things would not happen, would cease to exist, never would happen. No more rape either, no more kidnapping. All sorts of things would never happen if everyone went around armed. And so in our little posse, everyone is going to be armed except the hothead. The guy who wants to do something. We got to do something. God damn it, we got to go. Come on, let's get together. Let's get over there and do something. That guy has to surrender his firearm. He cannot be armed in this confrontation. The men who come to back him up, they can be armed. The guy whose door he's knocking on, he can be armed. But the guy who wants to knock on the door should go disarmed. And the reason is to disincentivize the violence, to take away the incentive to use force instead of words, to take away the incentive to seek to coerce compliance rather than to engage in an act of reasonable, rational persuasion. And it doesn't mean that the violence couldn't happen. It could. The guy whose door is being knocked upon could decide that he's going to shoot first and ask questions later. The guy who's knocking on the door could decide to throw a punch or just spit in the guy's face and meet with a disproportionate retaliation. But if the hothead, the guy who's spoiling for a fight, the guy who's looking to pick a fight, if he is disarmed, he will be substantially less likely to get frisky. And if he does, it will be his blood that is shed first. And the threat of his blood being shed first should induce still further moderation in his behavior. And if it doesn't, it's good odds we're well rid of him anyway. That our purpose as a polity in combining together, in living together, is to maximize our peaceful and profitable cooperation and to minimize our conflict. And virtually all of our conflicts will result from people who cannot moderate their behavior. Most of those people are actual criminals, and as discussed, they will either be dead or will have successfully changed their habits. But hotheads are typically not criminals. They're just incapable of controlling their behavior. And to the extent that there are hotheads living in the neighborhood, the sooner they self-identify and the sooner they are eliminated from our midst, the greater our future chances for peace and prosperity. And so Batman's Bluff does two things. It systemically creates peace by removing the incentive to resolve disputes violently. And in those circumstances where it fails to promote that peace, it tends to eliminate the greatest future threats to our peace. And this is a way of thinking about dispute resolution that actually results in dispute resolution rather than greater, ever more violent, ever escalating disputes. Your way is wrong about everything. I don't care where you stand in the political spectrum, you are wrong about everything. In order to see the world as it actually exists, you have to turn around and look at it my way instead. So, here we have some anarchy at the Church of Splendor. I've had a wonderful week this week. I've been kicking the shit out of the Ayn Rand Institute. I came up with a brand new argument against abortion that is thoroughly comprehensive, another one that takes care of the outlier objections like rape and threat to the mother's life. I elaborated on DISC in a way that really fleshes out the picture for other people. I didn't really add anything to my own knowledge, but I filled in a lot of detail that will help other people understand what I'm talking about with the DISC system. And I feel like I'm sitting on an egg that's going to hatch into something really wonderful. I never really know until this happens, but late summer is always very good for me. And this summer has been very good indeed. So I'm well, I'm happy. I hope you are too, and I wish you all the best. I'll talk to you again next week.